Russia has over 5,000 nuclear warheads, thousands of tanks and missiles, and one of the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth. But here's the real question. Can Russia afford a long war against NATO? Because modern wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by money. And in 2026, the economic gap between Russia and NATO is enormous. So this is not just a military comparison. It is an economic endurance test. Let's break it down. Section 1, Military Spending. In 2026, Russia's defense budget is estimated at roughly $100 to $120 billion. That is a significant amount, especially considering Russia's overall economy. But NATO's combined military spending is over $1.3 trillion. That is more than 10 times higher. The United States alone spends more on defense than Russia. When you combine the budgets of the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and other NATO members, the gap becomes massive. However, spending alone does not tell the full story. Russia allocates a much higher percentage of its GDP to defense. In some years, over 6% of national output goes directly into military spending. That means Russia prioritizes defense heavily. But that also means strain on the broader economy. NATO countries, on average, spend around 2 to 3% of GDP on defense. They have more financial flexibility. In a short conflict, Russia can mobilize quickly. But in a prolonged war, the spending gap becomes critical. Money fuels logistics. Money replaces equipment. Money sustains soldiers. And NATO has far more of it. Section 2, Economic Power Comparison. Now let's examine the broader economic picture. Russia's total GDP is roughly $2 trillion. NATO's combined GDP exceeds $40 trillion. That is more than 20 times larger. This difference is not minor. It is structural. A larger economy means more tax revenue, more industrial output, more borrowing power, more resilience. In prolonged conflicts, economic depth becomes decisive. Russia also faces ongoing sanctions from Western nations. These sanctions restrict access to technology, financial markets, and foreign investment. While Russia has adapted in many ways, restrictions still limit growth and modernization. NATO countries, by contrast, operate within the world's largest financial systems. They control major global trade routes. They influence international banking networks. In economic warfare, leverage matters. And NATO holds significant leverage. Section 3, Defense Production and Industrial Capacity. Modern war consumes equipment rapidly. Tanks, artillery shells, drones, missiles, aircraft components. Replacing these systems requires strong industrial capacity. Russia has a substantial defense industry. It produces tanks, aircraft, and missile systems domestically. However, sanctions have limited access to advanced microelectronics and high-tech components. This affects production speed and modernization. NATO countries benefit from broader supply chains. The United States alone has vast industrial infrastructure. European NATO members are also increasing defense production. In a long war scenario, production sustainability becomes critical. If equipment losses exceed replacement capacity, military strength declines over time. Russia may maintain strong early momentum. But sustaining that momentum over years is a different challenge. Section 4, Energy Revenues and Financial Stability. Russia's economy relies heavily on energy exports. Oil and gas revenues provide significant government income. During periods of high energy prices, Russia benefits. But energy markets are volatile. Sanctions and price caps can reduce revenue flows. At the same time, NATO economies are more diversified. They include finance, technology, manufacturing, and services. Diversification increases resilience. Financial stability is another factor. Access to global capital markets allows governments to borrow during crises. The United States, for example, can finance large deficits for extended periods. Russia has reserves. But long-term financial strain could limit flexibility. In a prolonged conflict, fiscal endurance becomes as important as battlefield performance. Section 5, Short War vs Long War. In a short, intense regional conflict, military readiness and immediate deployment matter most. Russia has demonstrated rapid mobilization capabilities. However, in a prolonged multi-year conflict, economic depth plays a larger role. A long war becomes a competition of production capacity, financial reserves, industrial strength, political stability, and public endurance. NATO's combined economic weight gives it structural advantages in long-term sustainability. But that does not automatically determine the outcome. Military strategy, geography, alliances, political decisions, and nuclear deterrence all influence the equation. But what if the conflict does not last months? What if it lasts 5 years? In a prolonged multi-year war, economic pressure compounds. What happens if the war lasts 5 years? Defense budgets rise. Government debt increases. Inflation becomes harder to control. In Russia's case, prolonged military spending at elevated levels would place serious pressure on public finances. Higher military allocation often means reduced funding for infrastructure, healthcare, and social programs. Over time, that can create domestic strain. On the NATO side, long wars are also expensive. However, larger and more diversified economies can absorb shocks more effectively. Access to global credit markets allows governments to finance extended operations. Another factor is industrial endurance. A 5-year conflict requires continuous production of ammunition, vehicles, and advanced systems. The side that maintains production efficiency without exhausting its economy gains a decisive advantage. History has shown that economic exhaustion can end wars before battlefield defeat. In prolonged conflicts, financial sustainability becomes as critical as military strength. And that is where the economic gap between NATO and Russia becomes most significant. There is also a political dimension. Long wars test not only economies, but public support. Sustaining military spending year after year requires political stability. In democratic NATO countries, public opinion influences defense budgets. In Russia, centralized decision-making allows faster military mobilization. However, prolonged economic strain can create pressure in any system. History shows that internal stability often determines external strength. And in a long conflict, domestic resilience may become just as important as battlefield performance. Final verdict. So can Russia afford a long war against NATO? In the short term, military strength may define the battlefield. But in the long term, wars are decided by endurance. Factories, energy, debt, industrial output, and the ability of a nation to sustain pressure year after year. NATO holds overwhelming economic weight. Russia holds strategic depth and military resilience. But in a prolonged conflict, the balance shifts away from weapons alone. It shifts toward economic survival. And in modern warfare, survival may be the most powerful weapon of all. The real question is not who fires the first shot. It is who can afford to keep fighting. If you found this analysis useful, like and subscribe for more strategic military breakdowns. And tell us in the comments. In a prolonged conflict, who would have the economic advantage? NATO or Russia?